Thank you all for joining us. As you heard the introductions, we are really strong panelists here. And if you heard Pari's presentation this morning, today there are about 5,000 global leaders from India, which are running global roles. And in the next 8 years, we forecast that it's going to be 20,000. So the exponential growth in that. And that requires, obviously, how have these leaders done it? What are some of the attributes which led to their success? So we're going to talk about that. What are some of the challenges which they'll have to address? And we have a very diverse panelists here. We have Debolana, who's kind of does research in it. She's head the HR department in various companies. She'll have a perspective from a research and a macro perspective. And then we have two practitioners. Again, there's a slightly different, Sindhu has been with the company for a long time and has risen through the ranks there. And then Hari has been able to, change jobs and still able to kind of grow his career in a very successful way. So we're going to find out what amongst their leaders, leadership skills, they were able to do that. So I'm going to start with Sindhu. So what do you define leadership, and how do you define your archetype of what kind of leader you are or would like to be?
Oh, wow, that's a big, loaded question. First of all, good morning, everybody. And it's great to be here. It's an honor to be amongst this very esteemed panelists. And to your question, Nilesh, for me, leadership starts within yourself, right? It's a journey. There is no kind of end target of what you reach when you talk about leadership. It's a constant. It's a journey where you're constantly evolving, where you're constantly learning. And for me, this journey has all been about how do I become a better person, right? And to kind of take away the me and go more into the we of leadership, right? And it's been a process as well, because if I look back at the last 20 years of my journey in the corporate world, I still remember, right, back then as a young developer, it was always about, I know the answer, I'm going to get to the answer. Today, it's not about that, right? It's about how do we get to the answers? How do we work together? How do we make sure that we include everybody in getting to those answers? And it has been a process. It is a learning. It's a constant. And for me, leadership is a journey where you're constantly in that journey of making yourself a better person.
Hari, same question to you.
I think I would echo a lot of what Sindhu is saying. Right? I would add a couple of things. One, a very intrinsic quality of leadership, for a successful leader at least, is to have empathy. Right? Part of being focused on the team essentially also means that you have to empathize with the people around you. You have to take people with you on the journey. As Sindhu rightly said, we all start off saying, let me solve the problem. I can do this. Often trying to prove that we have all the answers and be the smartest person in the room. But leadership is often about letting the team collectively arrive at it. And that may mean occasionally that you have to create room for failure, right? You have to create a safe enough environment that people are comfortable taking risks and that they don't feel like they're going to be penalized if they fail, as long as the learning is continuing. Right? The second bit is resilience. I think that's a very important quality for a leader, because you know that as a leader, you're going to go through ups and downs, personally as well as a team. And unless you can role model that resilience and continue to aspire and have ambition despite the ups and downs, you won't be successful in the long term as a leader, nor will the team be successful as well. So I think as long as you're focused on that, and then of course, making sure that at the end of the day, I think, as Sindhu pointed out, ultimately, you have to be facilitating and enabling the team to be successful. So it's about what is it that you can do for the team more than asking them to do something. Right? So it's like being there for the team, making sure that you're enabling them to be successful as they possibly can.
Right. So Debolana, you've been more in the research, HR. Have you seen any evolvement? Has the leadership evolved in the last 15, 20 years? What are the changes you think a leader has to go through in their journey? So if you can give us some perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks Nilesh. Thanks for inviting me here. And see, when I started my career, the definition of leaders or the sort of key requirements of leadership was that you needed to have one eye on the microscope and one eye on the telescope. so which was guaranteed to give anybody a headache, right? And 2 decades back, there was seminal work put out by Harvard on leadership and, what are the sort of lookout aspects for leaders, right? And they said that industries are going to evolve because of 6 factors. So they said, the global trends, and you have technology, you have workforce dynamics which are changing, you have consumer dynamics which are changing, consumer and workforce also changing, you also have social mores which are evolving, and then you have, so all of these, they said, some of these will keep happening and organizations need to adapt. So this whole microscope, telescope metaphor is contingent on the assumption that you're standing on stable ground. But that's not true anymore, If we look at it, all 6 dimensions of change are today impacting organizations. So the ground's not stable. So if we have to look at a metaphor of leadership, it's probably going to be, a locomotive on a rail track. And by that I mean, you will speed provided the rail track which is grounding you, and that's solid. And those rail track traits are enduring, right? And so we've heard both of the leaders here talk about humility, right? When we look at archetypes and what research sort of puts out as key leadership archetypes and traits in terms of being strategic,
Right.
or being a leader as a coach, a leader as a communicator, I think all of that is true. Today, leaders have, strategic ability is a given. You have to be able to, sort of sense and sense make simultaneously. We heard Sheena talk about humane leadership. So, intrinsically, what Sindhu talked about is, look at yourself and see how you're evolving. Very, very high level of self-awareness. And so the ability to challenge your own assumptions and biases and constantly question, because what was true yesterday is no longer going to be true today. The same paradigms don't exist. And therefore, learning agility, emotional intelligence, humane leadership is what she talked about, humility, all of these that's the rail track, and that's enduring. That's not changing. Yeah. And if that is in place, I think what we are seeing is leaders who have those basic traits and tenements are the ones who are actually succeeding in this crazy world of today.
Right. No, that's so correct. And actually, that leads me to a question. For me, I had a leader who told me, if you want to be a good leader, you have to be influential, right? And particularly when you are so remote, and all the GCO leaders, how do you influence global leadership? That you are able to not just become a cost arbitrage center, but a center for innovation, growth, impacting business globally. So Sindhu, and you have a very unique perspective that you were actually in Germany for a number of years. And do you find any difference in the way you influence global leadership than sitting here and while being there? Or if you can give us some perspective.
I think when it comes to the core of leadership, I think we're all in, doesn't matter which culture, which part of the world, I think the core value system is the same, right? And I think that's also important to acknowledge. Finally, when you're talking about leading and driving and getting people together, it's all, finally, we're all human beings, right? Mm-hmm. At the core of it. We are all human beings. We are all driven by pretty much the same needs, right? Pretty much. So as long as you imbibe that and understand that, I think the value that you bring to the table, right? That's what matters. And how do you get that value across? How do you bring teams globally across? And that has been always kind of the North Star, if you may will, in everything, the way I have operated, be it in Germany. I did spend 18 years of my career in Germany, and now it's back here to base in India, and it's fascinating to also been asked that question multiple times, to be honest, right? Like, hey, how do you see that cultural differences? Of course there are cultural differences. There's no doubt about that. I mean, just look at here. I mean, just look at this audience, right? Such a diverse audience. We're all having different kind of boundary conditions under which we operate, different things that have shaped our lives, right? And of course, there are cultural elements as well, which I think in India gives us also that edge, if you may will, because it's right from childhood, right? We've grown up with it, understanding all the different nuances. And I think I think is definitely a huge strength that you bring into any other culture in the world. Because for us, that whole value of living inclusion is something that we do by default, if you ask me, right? And everybody else is still like explaining what does it mean to live inclusion. We just do it every single day.
So just to kind of follow up on that, you talked about humility, kind of bring people together. Do you see, when you are influencing your leadership, do you deal it in a different way than you are working with your people? I'm assuming the needs are slightly different when you are motivating your teams as compared to influencing a global. How do you change that? What are the differences?
Well, it depends on the stakeholders you're working with, right? I mean, of course, if it's a stakeholder who really wants to understand what does this mean in terms of market impact and revenue, that's the conversation you'll be having. If you're talking to your development team, it's like, okay, really, what is the backlog that we'll be working on? And what is the value that we are talking about, right? But in all these conversations, Nilesh, I think one thing that stands out is, as a leader, you need to know what's the long-term vision, right? Doesn't matter which stakeholder you're talking to, you need to know that, because that's where people get motivated, driven, where they, even if they're in this smallest piece of the puzzle, they understand what's the larger context, and that's super important. And even if you're building a product, Hari, you know that, right? Like, before taking it to market, how do we price it? How do we make sure that even if it's the initial cut is not completely done, how can we still make that and stay there, be resilient, right? So I think these principles are universal.
Hari, when you joined Walmart, there were 1,000 people. In 5 years, there are 10,000 people. Obviously, that kind of growth in a global company like Walmart, it's not easy. So what was the things which you were able to build a confidence in the headquarters? And I believe that India team is one of the reasons Walmart has been successfully been competing as a global e-commerce leader. So what is, that's a huge, I give that as an example. And in fact, Walmart here is a sexy brand, so sorry to say that, is to work for, right?
I thought it was SAP, but okay.
SAP too.
But,
I think a lot of it goes back to what Sindhu said, right? It's about really essentially getting and driving that strong alignment. Ultimately, this is true for Sindhu, it's true for me. We don't think of ourselves as the leaders of the India Development Center or SAP or Walmart in India. We think of ourselves as leaders in SAP or in Walmart, which essentially means aligning to the strategy and the vision for the company. And then as a leader, what you're really doing is ensuring that you're making sure that you're generating clarity for the people, right? You're trying to understand, get them to understand, especially for people who are so far away from the home market or from the business, why are we doing the things that we're doing? Why does it matter? What's the impact it's having on our customers' lives? Why is it core to the company's strategy? And then making sure that you're able to, you're not always going to agree. The very nature of a large enterprise is that there will be disagreements from time to time. But through it all, you have to be transparent and you have to continue to build trust. As long as people see that you're coming in with the right intentions, that you're putting the company's interests first and foremost and your team's interests over and above your own self-interest, and that everything else follows from that, and that you're able to generate that clarity, you're able to generate enthusiasm and passion from within the teams by also making sure that you're explaining to them what's in it for them as well. Right?
Yeah.
And can be different things for different people. There's no one size that fits all. For some, it's career advancement or career development. For some, it's the impact that they're having. For some, it's the recognition amongst the peer community about the quality of work. So finding out what it is that is motivating each and every person in the team and aligning it to the overall strategy for the company and doing it in a very open, transparent way that engenders trust, I think that's the critical element to success.
I think that is so key, and I speak to a lot of GCO leaders, and sometimes I feel that they are more proud of being the head of India rather than being a leader in the global company, because it seems like that's more prestigious here. So I think that perspective that, hey, you're first a global leader and then a center head, not the other way around. So I think that's a good point. Devalina, what about, what do you think a lot of leaders who from India, Indian origin, have been very successful global leaders in a lot of large corporations, at least 30, and now at some numbers I've seen that close to 25% of S&P 500 are led by leaders of Indian origin. Is there anything inherent about our leadership or people qualities which has made them successful, and how can we double down on those?
Yeah, I think, if you look at it, you just look at, we take resilience for granted. Look at the number of people who've had to, deal with Bangalore traffic to come for this, and all of them have, they've come, just, okay, there's one more road where, some more metro construction is happening, and now we're back into a single lane, and, we're all cool with it. We just so adjusting, that whole Swalpa adjust Madi thing, I think is our whole DNA and ethos, right?
Good, somebody had to use some Kannada here, so.
Yeah, she told us she doesn't know Kannada, right?
And so that's one thing. I think that inherently the resilience is huge for us. And so when we get enabling environments which are, which sort of set us up, I think the growth is just exponential. That's one factor. And as Sindhu said, right, social inclusivity is something that all of us are so used to. That inclusion is a de facto, it's kind of a baseline thing for us, right? And so you don't have to really work to make it, and which helps bring in diversity of thought, accept new ideas. Even if you look at how we've grown up, many of us have grown up in large families. Learning to accommodate and adjust and accept other people's ideas. These are just, sort of very, very baseline things which help you work with people in a much more inclusive manner.
Coming back to your role models or mentors, or who did you look up to, which helped you kind of structure your leadership or your career? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I look back again, when I started off my career in technology, Nilesh, I think many of you in this room would agree that there were not many women role models in technology. I'm talking about women leaders in technology, right, back then. I have to tell you that everything that kind of shaped me at the core back then was definitely my parents. My mom was very clear on working hard and doing diligently in anything that you do. Doesn't matter what you do, they didn't have any kind of like, this is what you need to follow. But there were certain value systems that were core, right? And I think that's what's shaped me. But now if you just look at the transformation that we've seen as an industry, right? Today it's phenomenal to see so many great women leaders out there shaping the narrative when it comes to the corporate world, or shaping the narrative when it comes to the startup world, or shaping the narrative when it comes to the education space. I think it's great, and I'm really honored to be working with leaders like Debjani Ghosh, Nivriti Rai, Rekha Menon, so many of them, right? And today I think that's the onus that we all have in this room to build those organizations, to build and support and create those platforms where we have so many more women leaders, not just in technology, right, across. Because I think we owe it to our kids, we owe it to our young girls, where it's not just one, or you need to have that, right? And that's the work that we all need to do, if you ask me. So for me, it was really that core value system that kind of guided me. And today it's all about also building that equity in the systems that I operate in, right? Because we want to give back, we want to create those inclusive workplaces. We want to make sure that everybody has an equal say at the table, right? So that's what I'm fully in for, no?
Hari, I was listening to Pat Gelsinger of one of the conferences, and he said, having the right mentor is what led me to where I am. What do you think about mentorship? How important is that? And
I think it's something that is underappreciated, frankly, in my view. And there's actually two parts to mentorship, right? I've benefited tremendously from having some very strong mentors. In fact, one of the mentors one of my early on mentors was, so I used to work for a startup that got acquired by Kodak. And I ran into this gentleman who had been with Kodak for about 30 years, talking about having a long career at the company, right? And was really, since I had been in the Valley for most of the time, I had not had the good fortune to have been in a company for that long. And so my first reaction in talking to this gentleman was, 30 years in a company, wow, I cannot imagine myself being in a company for 30 years. And he said, well, how often do you typically change your job? And at that time I was telling him, every 4 or 5 years I would switch. And he said, well, in the 30 years I've had 7 careers at Kodak. And I've been fortunate enough that the company has a span of business that allows me to put roots, stay in a company, provide for essentially provide an environment where my family doesn't have to move from time to time. You can do that if you're in a large company like Kodak, in a place like Rochester. Or you can be in an ecosystem like Silicon Valley where you switch company to company while you're still maintaining the same roots in the location, right? So it's a matter of perspective. And the amazing thing about that conversation was, for the first time, you sort of opened my eyes to being able to look at things from a completely different perspective, right? And that continued on. And over the course of time, I have also had the opportunity to mentor a few people as well. But what struck me is I've learned as much mentoring people from the people that I mentored as I learned from my mentor, right? So I think too often a time we tend to approach mentoring as something that we're giving and we're not necessarily receiving as much. And at least in my experience, what I've discovered is that I've learned as much from the people that I've claimed to have mentored than probably what they got from me. So I think I look at every interaction as an opportunity to learn, every career shift as an opportunity to learn. And as long as Sindhu talked about this at the very beginning, right? It's about the continuous learning. It's about making sure that you have that self-awareness and you're constantly looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, how can I do better? What can I learn today? As long as you're approaching it that way, you can take the most advantage of either being a mentor or receiving from a mentor, right?
So, Debrina, one of the things which I find unique, little bit unique here, and maybe it's an emerging, that people tend to change careers on a whim, right? Like, I got 10% raise, so I'm going to go, or nowadays 30, 40%, 10% is changed. But how important it is to plan your career? If you want to be a Sindhu or a Hari in future, how important it is to think about, don't make these random, 30% raise decisions, but think about where you want to take your career. What do you think about that?
No, and I'll pick up from this aspect of having some great mentors who can help you on that. So somewhere in the middle of my career, I was very fortunate to have a manager who asked me, how are you planning your career? And that, for me, that was like, what's there to plan, right? And he said something which sort of stuck with me. He says, you get out of your house, and if you're going to a destination, like today we take Google Maps, you put the destination first and then you navigate. So have you thought about where you want to go? And then you can, decipher the route that you're going to take. Today, careers are not ladders anymore, that old archetype of saying that I'm going to just, same thing I'm going to do, and then, just the role is just going to expand. Today, careers are jungle gyms. And that requires all of us to think, and I'm asking all future leaders here in the audience, those present here and joining virtually, to think about this, right? Where do you want to go? Where do you want to land? Look at that job description. Look at the competencies, functional, behavioral, leadership competencies that you need to develop. And then try and, pretty much like a checkerboard, think what moves are going to get you there. Unfortunately, a lot of us make this mistake of, having a very serendipitous approach towards a career. Like, with a gust of wind, we'll go this way. Life took us there. And we're not thinking it out. We're not very deliberate about it. And so, Sindhu was very fortunate with an enabling environment where she got all those opportunities. And I'm sure Hari must have picked up those skills in the different roles that he did. But at the end of the day, it's about planning. It's about being very deliberate. And if we are that deliberate for something as mundane as a taxi ride, how come we're not that deliberate about what we're doing for our careers and our lives?
That's so true. So if today is one of the future leaders sitting here wants to plan that career, what are the avenues they have today? Like, they should approach you, or how they go about doing it?
First, decide where they want to go, And I know this is a very common question that HR asks, where do you want to be 5 years from now? And everybody laughs about that question. But that's a very important, you ask yourself, where do you want to be 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years? Where do you, is that the corner seat that you want? And corner seat by that, I mean, is it the CEO? Is it CMO? Is it CTO? What role do you want? And then, therefore, what skills do you need to get there? And what's the gap? And be honest. Be absolutely, brutally honest about the gaps in your own profile. Ask your spouse, they'll tell you.
Oh, that's dangerous.
So we'll open it up for a few questions. So if you have a question, stand up and then start with the question, not with the context, okay? And then could provide context. But let it be a question. So can somebody get a mic?
Thanks. My name is Abhishek, coming from Budweiser and Director for Solutions. My question is, how critical is ambiguity management as part of your leadership?
Can you hear this?
No, we can't hear you.
We can't hear. Can you
hold the
raise
mic
it,
a little
please?
closer, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. My question is, how critical is ambiguity management as part of leadership? And second part of that is, how do you build that trait in the young leaders?
How do you build that in young leaders?
Yes.
I think, I mean, look, change is the constant, as they say, right, to quote in a cliche. And more, once you're actually responsible with your interacting, whether you're managing people directly or not, the reality is that if you're working as a part of a team, there is always going to be inherent ambiguity, right? There's going to be ambiguity in the execution of the strategy. There's going to be ambiguity dealing with the personalities. So the sooner you're comfortable with that ambiguity and comfortable with knowing that you're not necessarily going to be able to provide all the answers, but that you're creating an environment and a culture that allows teams to come together and problem solve together, right? And set aside their egos, work together towards a common purpose, towards a common vision. I think the most important thing you can do as a leader, regardless of whether you actually manage people or not, right? Because leadership happens at every level of the organization, is ultimately in your interactions, you want to create a sense of purpose for the people that you're working with. If you're able to do that successfully, everything else will take care of itself, right? You'll find that you have to do very little active leadership, so to speak, if you're able to create that sense of purpose, because nothing motivates or, provides a level of commitment as that sense of purpose.
Can you hear me? This is Naveen, and I have a question about favorite failure. So we all learn from failures, and what will be your favorite failure? Maybe all the panelists can answer, or one of you. I would love to hear what you have learned from your failures.
What
have you learned from your failures?
Oh.
Failure, yeah.
Oh, okay. Maybe I take a concrete example to put things into perspective, right? Before this role, my previous role was to drive SAP strategy around the Intelligent Enterprise program, right? And maybe a little bit to give you a color on what that means, it meant that my role was to align technology adoption across our various lines of business. And you can imagine what that would translate into, right? Because every line of business has their P&L and they have their targets, and of course they come with their own beautiful technologies as well. And there was always this conversation on, now why should we adopt this piece of technology? And to your question on failures, if I had seen that role as kind of, hey, they did not adopt the technology, or they only adopted, say, 10% of what I had kind of started off as the journey, that would have been kind of crushing, right? But the way I dealt with it is I got the opportunity to work across our entire portfolio of SAP, which is massive, right? And had the opportunity to learn and understand what is it that matters for each of the LOBs. So if you kind of zoom out from each of these individual things, you can look at it in two ways. You can say, hey, technology adoption did not happen completely, or you can look at it at, oh, wow, what a massive opportunity to learn and understand and kind of bring that into your next role, right? So every failure, or I would say every challenging opportunity that you're put into is brilliant. And this goes back to the point what you were making. Do you statically kind of progress, or do you always be in those areas where you're learning, you're building up things within yourself, building teams together, and that's what keeps you going, right? Maybe it's not necessarily that you have to become the CTO or the CEO or crush yourself in that journey, but really, are you having fun? Are you learning? Are you failing enough to bring those learnings onwards? I think that's how I look at it.
I think for me, probably the one example that I would look back to is very similar to what Sindhu was talking about, but with more of an external facing dimension to it, right? So this was when I was working for a company that built enterprise middleware for the telco and cable industry. And suppose we came up with sort of the next generation of technology, and we got caught up in sort of breathing our own fumes about how this technology was going to change the industry, without understanding the fundamental business model of the industry, which is essentially all about cash flow. And for them, it's about, okay, if I have to now bring in a new piece of technology which requires me to put a new device inside the house, that's a massive outlay of capital. I have to train people, I have to go replace, set-top boxes in everybody's homes. And these are companies that are very, very risk averse. So that brought home the realization that it's not sufficient to just think about technology in of itself, but really understand what's the business context within which you're operating, and how does the industry that you're solving the problem for, what's the fundamental structure of the industry, and then work backwards from that. Today we talk about customer-backed thinking, right? It's exactly an example of that. Only in this case, the customer happens to be not an end consumer, but a very large enterprise, which makes it even harder, because there's so many layers within the enterprise that you have to go in order to sell, right? I mean, Sindhu knows this better than anyone else, working with Walmart as a enterprise provider. Companies take a long time to make these decisions because they have a very large impact on the organizational. And so when you're building a solution for such a company or for companies in that space, if you don't understand that market context and if you don't take the trouble to actually go talk to the customers and understand their business models, but just assume that if I build the technology, everybody is going to be beating down on my doors, it doesn't quite work that way. And that was a big sort of aha moment for me.
So I know time's up. So sorry, we can't get any more questions. But Rebel, to just kind of and we'll pass it on to all. What do we want the leaders to be talking about leadership in 5 years? What are some of the future trends you are seeing? Are you seeing any evolving and happening, or how do leaders? If Sindhu was starting today, would she be doing anything different than what she did, for example?
No, I think she's doing great. So. But, I think from the context of the workforce and, the psychological needs of how the needs have changed, probably, when you and I joined the workforce, if we got our basic roti kapda makan, we were happy. And job security was probably the most aspirational thing. But then those needs have changed, right? I mean, till about decade and or so, prior pandemic, I think conversations are about how do you engage, how do you motivate. Today, the organizations are getting into, and leaders have to understand, with the emerging workforce which is coming in, driving a sense of purpose is the most important one. Hyper-personalization is most important. How are you going to make something, work or rewards, which is customized to my need, and how do you drive that sense of purpose for me, which can be very different from what it is for him. And then we are all in the same ecosystem. And so, you're trying to build in the sense of fairness while being different, while differentiating. And that's the need. I think that ability, you're on that knife edge trying to balance both aspects of it. I think that's one. The skill, today, half-life of skills has come down to 2 to 2.5 years. That means not just, if me as a leader, but the workforce, they need to constantly upskill. Because skill obsolescence is just too high. And which then leads to this whole talent shortage thing. And then, you're constantly battling that issue. So I think these are some of the things that leaders have to focus on going forward.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is that, something that I've been pleasantly surprised, especially with the new kids coming out of college today, is sort of the social conscious or social consciousness, which is that for them, they're also looking at it saying, I want to be part of an organization that is leaving the earth in a better place. Right? It's not sufficient to be just sustainable, but are you actually going that extra step to be regenerative in your practices? Are you doing good for the communities that you're a part of? So I find more and more employees asking that question, wanting to be part of that organization. So there's a sense of purpose that goes even beyond their own careers, which actually is very, very encouraging in many ways. Right? I think, and I see that picking up more and more. My own daughters, and they're just graduating from college, and as they look at companies, that's one of the things they're factoring in, saying, I want to look at the reputation of the company, how is it perceived in the community it's a part of. That to me is very encouraging, right? And I think that shift is going to only accelerate even more.
Any closing remarks?
No, I think everything that had to be said was said, and I'd just say that empathy will always be in style, no matter what, right? And empathy to your own self, empathy to everyone else you work with, right? Because like Hari said, I mean, you're dealing with multiple generations, so you need to be empathetic to yourself, that you may not understand the nuances of every part of every generation, right? How could you? So I think empathy will never go out of style.
On that note, sorry, we don't even have time for closing remarks, but thank you all. Really appreciate your great insights, and we have something for you, I believe. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabriela.